people from below think of the world? What did they think of their constitution? What did they think of Parliament? We cannot ignore the fact that many saw it as a den of thieves and that there is justice in that characterization. Likewise, in terms of war, you heard several of these people had been soldiers or veterans of the campaigns in Egypt, campaigns in the Caribbean, against slave revolts, against the USA, against France. And the conspirators called the military the system of man-eaters. This was their expression. Because war at that time consisted of of killing. Soldiers were trained to kill. And they did so with sharp steel. Or with the most advanced weaponry of the time, which was cannon. To understand the system of man-eaters meant to understand thermodynamics. To become good at artillery meant understanding ballistics. Despard, like Napoleon, was a skilled artilleryman. He thus was at the forefront of military technology of that period, at a time when the British Empire was most aggressive, because it had been defeated in North America and it sought recompense for this. In India, in Africa, in South Africa, in West Africa, in the Caribbean, and here in the Great Lakes. Okay. Where was I? History from below, who these chaps are, working class. Oh, I didn't talk about technology or capitalism. This book really refrains from ever using the expression industrial revolution, because I think it was neither. It wasn't industrious. In fact, it turned work into something boring, alienating, and killing, repetitious and deadly, the opposite of what we mean by industrious. As for a revolution, it was a counter-revolution. That's what Edward Thompson used to teach us, and you don't need him either to understand that it was a counter-revolution. 1803 or 1801, the year before, Napoleon says goodbye to the French Revolutionary calendar. He says goodbye to the age of reason. He makes a deal with the Pope. This is a time of counter-revolution. And this mass hanging that takes place in February 1803 is a turning point. Gandhi used to say that England prefers to hang at home and massacre abroad. But Gandhi was not a serious British social historian, or at least his notion of massacre. So I think we must say that a 7 killing and a mass hanging is close to a massacre. To be sure, it's fewer than were killed at Peterloo in Manchester in 1819. Nevertheless, this was an act that was meant to teach the working class, to teach the 20,000 people fear, trauma. Yeah. Now, looking from below, we'll see that it's a public hanging. And just looking at the dress, you can see there's several, there are men and women. There are people with culottes and who are sans culottes, to use a French expression for a militant street activist, revolutionary. There are well-dressed, there are trousered people. It's a heterogeneous outfit. Perhaps other skilled costume historians could indicate other refinements from here. But what this book shows us, it says it's a story of race and class, is that the working people who were being mobilized were all over the Atlantic. Gabriel Prosser, for example, in Virginia, was hanged in 1800. Richard Parker, the president of the fleet, when the British fleet mutinied, 30 ships mutinied in 1797, Richard Parker was among the 40 who were hanged from the yardarm for it. And we're all very thankful to those sailors. Why? Because we have 16 ounces in the pound. That's what they fought for, and that's what we have. Before, the purser gave them 12 ounces. I remember. How do you say that in Spanish? Sailors, artisans, those handicraft people, where now their trades are being undermined by deliberate technological unemployment mechanisms. Thomas Helliker, for instance, is hanged in 1802 in the West Country. He had been a a cropper. He uses vast shears to crop the cloth after it comes off the loom. To get is a highly skilled, because a slight mistake and you ruin the whole piece. He was hanged. Thisbe is hanged in Trinidad. She was a servant. So there's just an array of servants, sailors, slaves, and artisans all across the Atlantic basin who are now subject to this kind of terror. And this book describes them. And it describes also that dispossession. And we should have another card, and I should make all of you memorize and not leave this room until you've memorized the following poem. And if you know it, say it along with me. We're going to say it several times, because I'm serious now. I want you all to know it. The law locks up the man or woman who steals the goose from off the common, but lets the greater villain loose who steals the common from the goose. The law locks up the man or woman who steals the goose from off the common, but lets the greater villain loose who steals the common from the goose. Not bad. Very good. Very good. This University of Chicago is someplace. That's the first time I've ever heard that done on the second try. That was great. I was in Amsterdam last May. It took ages for that to do it. Really. This is very good. Yes. So ponder that, and you will see the relationship between dispossession and mass incarceration. Now go back with that refrain in your mind. The law locks up the man or woman who steals the goose from off the common. There's your mass incarceration. And so it was. The prison system is being constructed in the 1790s. Massive. This is the story that Michel Foucault tells. Should I not quote his name here at the University of Chicago? I hope so. I'm trying to be smart. Dispossession, the relationship to who stole the goose from off the common. That Thomas Helliker, Richard Parker, every worker under the power, the sway of capital was being dispossessed from the tools, means, and materials of production. Not just of land, not just by conquest, but also by technology. And this is a theme which this book has to tell in detail. In each craft, even in the cities, even with cloth, with porcelain, with iron, with coal, workers had with sugar, with cotton. Those who made the world had to use the materials of the world and took some, just like the cook will lick her fingers. You follow me? This, don't call it sabotage. Don't call it embezzlement. Don't call it theft. Call it a kind of memory. Call it a kind of community building, because that's what it is. This brings us now to another C, my final C, the C of the commons. This is a forms of commoning. Criminality, at that time, is a form of commoning when you do history from below. For what? You used to work in a shipyard. You might have to have a piece, a knee, which would have a certain shape. You'd have to saw it, use an adze. There's going to be waste product. I call it waste product. Those are chips. Who gets those chips? Well, the shipwright's going to take them, isn't he? He's going to take them home for his fuel, to build his house. So it's not just ships that are being built, but it's workers' houses, workers' forms of life. That is required, that dispossession, in order to introduce the wage form, where the wage is the exclusive form of income. That's the theme. That story is told here. Tammy, I haven't been keeping track of how long I'm talking.
It's 2:48.
So I've been talking, would you say, half an hour or so? Okay, can I talk a little bit longer?
I think so.
Is this all right? Can I have
Please.
an okay on that?
Yes.
All right. Okay, we'll go a little more. What did I? Oh, I guess two things need to be talked about right away. Let's look at this picture again, and you'll see at the extreme left of it a chimney. Well, I could talk to you about how the chimneys were cleaned, but British humanitarianism was such that a warm meal was required by Parliament once a week for the chimney sweepers. And also, nobody could be put down a chimney less than 4 years old. So here is British humanitarianism at work. And I quoted with Penny and Paul yesterday, and I'd like to quote it to you all again. Our man Despard is from Ireland, and the book describes the customs in Ireland before the expropriation from land and his childhood. But from that, he had an experience, an Irish experience, and I'm passing it on to you. These little poems, these little proverbs, they summarize class experience. And here's the experience of the Irish. Be aware of three things. The hoof of a horse, the horn of a bull, and the smile of an Englishman. To get back to that hypocrisy and that dispossession. And what I wanted to get to, was 2 weeks ago I heard this chap on PBS from the Council on Foreign Relations talk about, this was when the Supreme Court in England had said the prorogation of Parliament was unconstitutional, null and void. It's also at a time when many Americans had begun to think again, after the Kavanaugh hearings, after the Electoral College, we're beginning to think also about the Constitution of the U.S. What needs to be reconstituted? How are we going to do it? When are we going to do it? This chap on the PBS, he referred to this as a crisis of the Anglo-Saxon democracies. And then a few days later, there was a story in the New York Times by Mandel, his name was, also referring to Anglo-Saxon democracies. And it's a euphemism that you will find here among University of Chicago professors, at least in the past. Anglo-Saxon democracies. This is a code word for white supremacy. It's a code word that developed in the 19th century for white supremacy, but it's Anglo-Saxon. But why don't they say white supremacy? Because they want to exclude Ireland. You see? That's why. Because the British industry, the factories, the sailors, the soldiers, depended on Irish man-eaters, on Irish cannon fodder. So when it says Anglo-Saxon, you think Ireland. Similarly, in the U.S., everyone in the United States now has no excuse for not thinking 1619. Because that's when the first slaves from Africa were brought to the North American mainland continent. 1619. Not 1776. Put that out of our minds for a bit. We have to rethink our story. And this book is partly a rethinking of the origin story of this transatlantic, quote, civilization. Because you can't say Anglo-Saxon democracy for America unless you also think African American. John left, didn't he?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Because he could help us a lot with that. Because he's a specialist, I think, in slavery and capitalism. But this is a subject that no longer needs specialists. It now must become part of our world story. So to have PBS and New York Times suddenly now talk about Anglo-Saxon democracy, I thought something seriously amiss. But here's where the confusion for me comes in. I say it meant white supremacy in that last century, the 20th and the 19th century. Before that, to be Anglo or to be Saxon meant you were not Norman. And the Normans had brought in the aristocracy and feudalism into England, which otherwise, under the Angles and Saxon, had the folk mote, the wapentake, and these forms of direct popular democracy. And before that, at the time of the English Revolution, Anglo-Saxons meant the commons. So here is a term that has really been, like industrial, has been turned upside down. Its meaning has been inverted. Because to speak of Anglo-Saxon, to speak of England as belonging to Angles and Saxons, or to speak of the United States as being ruled by Angles and Saxons, is to accept the class and race natures of these societies. And when I say class and race nature, I'm referring to the plantation and to the factory and the prison. These are the principal institutions. What brings them together is the ship, the sailing ship, historically. And thus the sailor is the key to this political, economic constitution of this world that had produced, well, an ideology of progress, that had produced the ideology of technical innovation in order to justify and to increase the exploitation of humankind. Okay, I feel myself rapidly becoming less a historian and more of a preacher. So I think I better
Preach it.
I think I better slow down and have a look at the notes here. Well, we did that. I'm just saying that, come on, it's serious. It's serious. I'm not being silly. Amand Despard had experience in forms of commoning, forms of the commons, in Ireland, in Jamaica, in Belize, Honduras, his brothers in North America. And in England, the English artisan studied and shared this experience and developed notions of the commons themselves including Thomas Paine, you know. Thomas Spence, you should know. We should all know Thomas Spence, because he also said that the world belongs to all. It's not just to a few. And in the United States, the main man of the U.S. Constitution, the man who fractionates human beings, who produced that fraction 3/5, that man's name, who is named James Wilson. He's the fractionator who made it possible for that constitutional compromise between the merchants and industrialists of the North, the planters and the slaveocrats in the South. That was we used to always be taught in constitutional law class, the principal compromise that produced the 1787 USA Constitution. But the man who did that, made that, his name was James Wilson. He was smarter than James Madison, they all said at the time. He was a student of David Hume, the philosopher. He was the lead lawyer for the Bank of North America with James Wilson. He gave the first lectures at the first law school of the United States, which was Penn, in 1791. And his theme was private property. His theme was against the commons. That was the principal theme of the first lectures at the University of Pennsylvania Law School by James Wilson, who was Washington's appointee to the Supreme Court. The reason you haven't heard of him is that he was such a scoundrel, even within the ruling class, because he owned millions of acres of land in the Yazoo Valley in Georgia, as well as the Ohio Valley. And he Timmy, I'm just thinking of someone's remark in the last few days, trying to understand President Trump's land deals and real estate deals. It was this, I think, same skills were required to understand James Wilson, what his deals were. With land that did not belong to him, shall we? Okay. The Irish people came, sat at the feet of not Tecumseh, the corn planter. I'm referring to the Iroquois League. Took down the stories, brought them back to Dublin, published Iroquois origin stories, Iroquois folk tales, compared them to Homer, thought they were greater than Homer, published them in Dublin in 1802. It just makes my heart. So I'm seeing different people from below, you see, making connections with one another, trying to build another path for humankind than that of expropriation and dispossession. And the story of those tales are part of that different class. Ireland, of course, is facing 30,000 were destroyed in the summer of 1798.